Good morning and welcome to Kunzan Payo Julian. We're always glad to have you join us for a teaching by Jetsunma, Ahkon, Lhamo. This teaching today is from 1991, was the original teaching. Her title is Aspirational Bodhicitta. This is something we can all do now. So I hope you enjoy it, and we'll begin now.
Many of us as adults have the same situation that the children have just described. In fact, recently I've been having a lot of consultations with new people, and new people ask me the very same questions. How do I deal with this? I live in this world where people are not Buddhist, and I work where people are not Buddhist, and I really don't know how to handle this. Should I tell them I'm Buddhist, or should I keep it to myself? And sometimes they describe actually losing some friendships when they become Buddhist. And the reason why that happens is that they tell their friends that something really important is happening to them, that something meaningful is happening to them, and that it's genuinely part of their lives and genuinely important. And in doing that, sometimes their friends think that they've lost it, you know, that they've done something really strange or gone off the deep end or bit the big tamale in some way. And this is a concern for adults as well. Generally speaking, Penna Rinpoche describes that Buddhism is something that one practices in the heart. And unless one wishes to take robes which are an obvious display of one's purpose and intention, and those robes involve a very deep sense of very, very evident renunciation, unless one chooses to do that, one need not display in any way the concerns of one's heart. In fact, if you feel the need to constantly display that you are a Buddhist, perhaps one good step to take would be to examine your motives. What is the motivation? If the motivation is genuinely wishing to communicate something very precious to you to others who you think might benefit, then choose well and wisely who are those that might benefit. If you somehow wish to identify with a certain group or wish it known that you're doing something exotic, then you should examine that very thoroughly. That's not a very good motivation, not very pure. And it will really not lead to good result. Eventually we'll stumble all over ourselves and make mistakes doing that. So it would be really good if you could examine your motivation and act appropriately in that way. And speaking of people coming to me for consultations, actually the subject for this teaching today comes from consultations that I've recently had with people, which I feel hopefully serve the people very well, and hopefully, and certainly I know that they serve me very well, in that I have a better understanding of what goes on in the practitioner's mind and what concerns that they ordinarily have. And I usually have a mixture of consultations. I have meetings or teachings or consultations with my long-term students that have been with me for some years. And then I also have meetings or consultations with sometimes first-time students or students that I've been with only a short time. And it's interesting to find out that the concerns that practitioners have don't change all that much over the years. It's not as though we haven't answered questions or we're still revolving in the same stuff. The questions, I think, develop and become more sophisticated, but they're primarily the same in some ways. Furthermore, the difficulties or stumbling blocks that students experience, they actually experience in the beginning and then experience again, and sometimes continuously, as they move through the different levels and stages of practice. But again, the stumbling block becomes more sophisticated in a certain way, that it's the same issue. It's always the same issue. Due to certain consultations that I've had recently, I would like to talk about the practice of compassion or bodhicitta as being fundamental to this path. But before I do that, I would like to say that no matter who you are, when you first meet with the path, or when you begin to practice the Dharma and consider for the first time that this life is going to be about achieving realization, that this life is going to be transformed into a vehicle by which one can achieve liberation, that once you absolutely consider that and therefore are willing to apply the technology conscientiously and firmly and diligently in such a way that it will bring results. In other words, practicing the technology exactingly. At that time, there is a tremendous change that the mind stream undergoes. And even by virtue of making that decision, making it in a heartfelt and pure way, a tremendous change occurs. From one point of view, you could say that many gross defilements actually fall away. In fact, when one takes the initiating vows, the vows that actually put one's feet firmly on the path of the vows that are called refuge vows and bodhisattva vows. When one takes those vows, particularly the bodhisattva vow, it is considered that an enormous amount of gross defilements actually fall away from the mind stream, in that the bodhisattva vow is a vow of compassion, in which one vows to participate from this time until we achieve supreme realization in benefiting others, and that one will certainly achieve realization in order to benefit others, as it is that when one achieves realization, that is when one is able to bring about the most benefit for sentient beings. That when one actually takes that vow, at that time, one is applying the antidote to many, many lifetimes of self-absorption, pridefulness, and ego-clinging. And so that vow is very precious. It actually is considered to be an antidotal medicine. When one continues on into the path, obstacles will arise then as well, not only in the beginning, when one first assumes the path and one has many questions and one simply does not know how to integrate practice into one's life. And that does happen at the beginning, but as one continues, obstacles do arise. We continually struggle with how much time we have to practice. That is always a struggle. If you look around you, you'll notice that none of us here was born in a secluded mountain in the Himalayas. We are here in this modern day world. At least I don't think any of you were born. No, you stick out like a sword. There you go. Secluded mountain in the Himalayas. Very good. Anyway, you're not there now. That's for sure. And that being the case, you have some difficulty with practice time. This is a modern day world, and it's a difficult issue. Furthermore, people do struggle with the idea that what they have adapted, what they've taken onto themselves, is very exotic. And it does kind of single you out, as probably you guys know. That often the long-term friendships and relationships that you have will be changed somewhat, because if you wish to talk about what's most precious to your heart now, you have to find a bridge, a way to communicate. And some relationships, unfortunately, do not survive that. Some do very poorly with that kind of transformation, while others do survive, according to the karma of the relationship. Furthermore, oftentimes people will go into the practice of Dharma thinking, hey, I've got it licked now. I'm going to be a Dharma practitioner. I'm going to be extremely together. I'm going to be very spiritual. I'm going to elevate my life into a loftier place. Yeah, it's going to be smooth sailing now. Well, from that point on, you actually will incur obstacles rising that you might not have incurred ordinarily. Oftentimes what happens to the practitioner who begins with the best of intentions is that they get through their method, through the path, to take a good hard look at themselves. And taking a good hard look at themselves, they often find out that they have more root poisons inside of them than they could have possibly have imagined. That once it is actually required of them that they make sacrifices, that they engage in active practice, that they go through the motions of the technology and actually move through it, that what rises to the surface of the mind are qualities that they never thought existed, like pridefulness, selfishness, egocentricity, ego-clinging, arrogance, things that we didn't even know were in there, anger, hatred. And while in the beginning, adapting the path, we think that we're so slick, oftentimes during the course of the path we find out that once we receive some teachings, we've learned enough to know that we are totally ignorant. And that's always a disturbing thing to find out. But these are things that all practitioners go through. And actually they are indications that one is really moving. If Dharma were not capable of cutting like a knife, if it were not capable of really stirring the depths of samsara, or cyclic existence, how could we possibly assume that it will lead us to enlightenment? How could we think that it has any real potency? You must assume that Dharma will produce change. You must assume that it will stir up the depths of one's mind stream. You must assume that it will cut through delusion. You must assume that change will occur. Generally speaking, when obstacles arise during the course of the path, during the course of one's practice, one should generally, across the board, assume that there is a lack of, that one needs to practice more virtuous activity. And here's the way to view that. It doesn't mean that one is particularly or especially non-virtuous. It isn't like that at all. But rather that in order to meet with the path, to form the auspicious connection with one's root teacher, one's root guru, to be able to apply one's capacities, to actually be able to apply oneself sufficiently, to be able to practice deeply, and to continue that practice, to go through whatever changes must occur in the life in order to engage in that practice, and to have good result. A tremendous amount of virtue is required. In fact, it is taught that you can safely assume that if you have the good karma to be able to take the refuge in bodhisattva vows, to actually engage in a firm way on the path, and actually study the technology, if you have that good karma, then you must in the past you should assume that in the past you have been extremely virtuous over the course of many lifetimes. You should assume that you have practiced generosity. You should assume that you have practiced some kind of meritorious or virtuous activity that has kind of put money in your spiritual bank, that has brought you to this condition. You should assume that. However, as this process continues, it continually requires more virtue to continue. And it's almost a catch-22 situation in that one is engaging in the path in order to create a more virtuous mind stream, in order to practice meritorious activity, but one also requires merit in order to do that. And so, of course, in Vajrayana particularly, the technology is such that hooked into or threaded through the practice technology, there are many methods to accumulate virtue. Not only are there methods that lead to enlightenment directly, but there are also methods that accumulate storehouses of virtue. This is part of the religion or part of the technology. You know, through making offerings, through certain kinds of practices that generate that kind of virtue. And so it's pretty much set up to work. But it doesn't mean that you as a student will not, from time to time, have certain kinds of obstacles arise within the mind stream. And those obstacles can be deluding. They can be very difficult to understand. Students will come to me and they'll say, suddenly I find that I'm falling asleep when I practice. What does that mean? Does that mean that I'm just too tired, or is my health bad? And they want me to do a health checkup on them. And that's generally not the case. It's generally that they need to accumulate some more virtuous activity. There's non-virtue that is causing them to separate from their practice in some regard. Or sometimes students will come up to me and they'll say, well, I thought I was going to be a Buddhist, and now I am a Buddhist, and now I just don't know what to do about it. I'm confused, and I'm sort of like that anyway. I sort of go in great guns and suddenly I fall apart midstream. Or I'm experiencing this confusion that I did not experience in the first place. And they look at that as though that were so solid and so real that, yes, I'm like that, which makes it written in stone, you know. Yes, I'm like that. I used to be like this in the beginning, and now I'm just like that now, just like this now. Isn't that so typical of me? That's how I am. And of course, when you think like that, you've written it in stone, and you can't fight that. You can't do a thing with that. What I recommend to students is that they stand outside of themselves, stand outside of their practice, and look at the event, and understand that from a metaphysical point of view, and metaphysics are actually very cut and dry in some regards. They're very mathematical or mechanical. And from a metaphysical point of view, they had this certain karmic potential that ripened as their capacity to meet with the path and adapt the path. And then after some time, a struggle began, and that struggle began due to the need to accumulate more virtuous activity. And they actually need to simply put that thought about themselves aside and engage in virtuous activity and break through that, because you will break through that if you engage in virtuous activity. It's simply a lack of merit. And we all have the problem. It doesn't single any of us out as being particularly odious. It's just the condition of cyclic existence, the condition of sentient beings. On the other hand, you might have plenty of virtue to see you through the path, but that the seed of that karma, of that beneficial karma, is simply not ripening quickly enough. Or that mixed karma is ripening, virtuous activity and non-virtuous activity is ripening, and they're ripening at the same time. Well, these are some of the concerns that students have, and these are some of the answers that I give them. But back to the idea of bodhicitta, which is, in this case, although I will not give a thorough teaching on bodhicitta or compassion, is very much tied up with the idea of virtuous activity. Students will come to me for the first time for many different reasons. And again, those reasons are always a reflection of the content of one's mind stream, or the karma of one's mind stream. Students will come to me sometimes because they've read about me, or they've read about Buddhism, or they have some kind of funny reason, and something has hooked them, something exotic about the path has hooked them, and they just want to sniff it out, basically, see what it's all about. And they take it, they swallow it, they eat something of it, which is good if it works. But at some point, because the technology of this path is based on the idea of compassion, or bodhicitta, that idea has to be fundamental, primary. It has to be the moving force. And if that transition is not made, there is great difficulty, and the student will fall away from the path, absolutely. Eventually, they will fall away from the path. I have never, not once, seen a student come into the path for selfish reasons. That is to say, to achieve realization for their own sake, or to collect this exotic method, or to assume the characteristics of a practitioner in some materialistic way by just collecting the attitude. I have never seen a practitioner who comes to the path in that way without changing radically ever stick with it. They will drop away, and they will think that they have dropped away for their own personal reasons. So the bodhicitta must be practiced. And if it is not practiced initially, then one should practice it straight away. Furthermore, again and again and again, the lamas, the bodhisattvas, and especially the Buddhas will teach that compassion is the strongest force that exists. Like water that can wear rocks away, it is the force that cuts through all delusion. It cuts through any situation that is harmful or uncomfortable. And the reason why is that all situations that come to us or that we meet with due to our karma. And compassionate activity is the strongest changer and purifier of one's karma that there is. There is no question about that. In the beginning, when one practices bodhicitta or compassionate activity, one doesn't really have a slick technology to apply. One has to practice kind of by the seat of the pants. And at that point, that kind of practice is called aspirational bodhicitta. But aspirational bodhicitta is actually a technology in itself. It is an extremely important portion of the technology and should not be abandoned even at the most advanced levels of practice. Aspirational bodhicitta, of course, consists of the aspiring to be of benefit to others. And that aspiring to be of benefit to others has to be examined very thoroughly. There is a definite knack to it. Because where it will be of the lower kind, where it will be of the most impure kind, is where you aspire to be a kind person. That's not a particularly advanced kind of aspirational bodhicitta. Or where you aspire to be a nice guy or a nice lady. That idea is more about you than it is about kindness. Oftentimes I will see students come to me for the first time, and then later on as well, they will come to me and they'll say, oh, I've got the bodhicitta part down. I mean, I really have that. I'm secure when it comes to compassion. It's the other stuff I don't get very well, which is so off the wall that one can hardly believe it. Until the time that we achieve supreme realization, none of us ever should consider that we have bodhicitta down, because what we have down is self-concern. The person that wishes to appear sweet and syrupy and kind and gentle, that person is really more about self-absorption than about anything else. Oftentimes a person will wish to have it be very clear to everyone else that they are spiritual and they adapt to spiritual demeanor. And it's meaningless in terms of their practice. Utterly meaningless. Aspirational bodhicitta definitely is a technology of its own, and there is a knack to it. And the knack to it is this: that one should have thoroughly and firmly and clearly examined the faults and limitations and sufferings of cyclic existence, till one understands from the depth of one's heart how cyclic existence is and how it must work out. And all of its faults one should examine from the depth of one's heart. And understanding it thoroughly, one should be able to look around and say, enough is enough. There is enough suffering here. Enough. Sentient beings have been suffering for long enough. Furthermore, one should not identify with one kind of sentient being over another. For instance, some people like to say about themselves, I'm a people person. And of course that's more about you than it is about kindness. Or other people will say, I'm an animal person. I really love animals and I have a thing about animals. That's more about you. That's more about how you identify yourself than it is about kindness. Or some people will say, well, I'm neither, but I like to think about my family a lot. Well, that's, again, that defines you. That isn't about kindness. In order to really practice bodhicitta, one must understand that all sentient beings are equal, that each one of them are sentient, they are feeling creatures, and that they are involved with and revolving in the intrinsic suffering of cyclic existence, the suffering, the suffering of change, the suffering of impermanence, the suffering that is ultimately always due to desire. That all sentient beings suffer that way. Human beings suffer from doubt, and therefore cannot practice the path even when it's right in front of them. Animals suffer from dullness or stupidity and cannot save themselves if someone tries to hurt them. Non-physical beings that are called hungry ghosts, that are grasping, desirous beings, suffer from the inability to ever have what they need. They suffer from grasping, from hunger, from thirst, from neediness. Well, of course, you know human beings that suffer from that as well, and animals as well. All of the different kinds of suffering that any kind of being, physical and non-physical, on any realm, can suffer from, we all share and we all have that in common, and therefore we are all equal in that we are suffering, but we wish to be happy, and we have within us the Buddha nature that will prevail ultimately with practice. That's true of humans, animals, physical beings, formless beings. And we are equal. So to understand that if one were to look at the 3,000 myriads of universes, and if one were to look at all cyclic existence, both form and formless, one would certainly determine that there are more sentient beings revolving in cyclic existence than there are grains of sand on all the beaches of the earth. Uncountable numbers. Uncountable numbers. And that they all feel and they all are actually the same and have the same weight. Therefore, we decide to practice. And that is the basis of the technology of aspirational bodhicitta. We cannot bear to see them suffer anymore. We wish, we see their suffering, we see it, we feel it, and we wish that their suffering would cease. And we begin, and aspirational practice is practiced by beginning with practicing wishing prayers. Simple wishing prayers. And in the beginning, just prayers from the heart. Just prayers from the heart. One can, in one's own words, say, I have seen the suffering of sentient beings and it's too much. May there be an end to suffering. May all of the causes of suffering be completely eradicated. From the depth of my heart, I wish and I pray that my life would be utilized as a means by which some suffering could be ended. That sometime in the future, I myself will be able to return in a potent way to end the suffering of sentient beings. In fact, I am so moved by the suffering of sentient beings that I promise this, that if I were the only one that had the capacity to eliminate the suffering of sentient beings, that I alone would return sufficiently, enough times, under any conditions, to be able to benefit sentient beings. That's aspirational bodhicitta. That when one walks around, one should think that even as I walk on this road right now, may all sentient beings walk on the path to enlightenment. And as one opens a door, one should think, even as I open this door now, may all sentient beings open the door to liberation and enter thereby. And as I take a shower, even as I take the shower, may all sentient beings be cleansed of the defilements that bring about their suffering. And as I eat, even as I eat, may all sentient beings be nourished by the teachings of the Buddha and accomplish them accordingly. And that even as I digest the food that I eat, may they digest the teaching in such a way as to be utterly moved and transformed. These are the kinds of prayers that are the practice of aspirational bodhicitta. And they are the beginning, and in some ways they are the ultimate practice. Because if we ever lose sight of aspirational bodhicitta, on that day, we have taken the first step toward losing the path. It's written in stone then. And on the day that we again take aspirational bodhicitta back to ourselves, we have then begun to find our way home again. So whether you are a beginning practitioner and that's the only practice that you have, it is an excellent practice. Or whether you are an advanced practitioner and you feel that you're well on your way to accomplishing Dharma, that is still your most advanced practice. It is your best. Even if you are practicing the most highfalutin, extraordinary technology, without that practice, it is ordinary. It is nothing. And that is certainly the case. During the course of one's practice, one will move from aspirational bodhicitta into what is called practical bodhicitta. And in the practice of practical bodhicitta, one will accomplish certain techniques that are meant to create, and are in fact, the method by which one will establish oneself as firstly a bodhisattva, which is an awakening being, and ultimately a Buddha. And as a Buddha, one will then be able to, in a potent way, hook sentient beings into their practice, establish them firmly in their practice through delivering to them and nurturing them with the method, and then ultimately securing them in enlightenment. But only as a Buddha or as a great bodhisattva can one actually accomplish this. And only really as a Buddha can we truly liberate beings. So in that sense, the practice of practical bodhicitta has a lot to do with establishing oneself in enlightenment. But that should never be done selfishly. One should never think, okay, now I've practiced aspirational bodhicitta, now I'm on to the practical stuff, and I'm really going to be a Buddha now. One should never think like that, because believe me when I tell you, even the most advanced, most promising practices will fall flat as a pancake. If there is no bodhicitta, there is no practice. And during the course of establishing oneself in practical bodhicitta, one actually learns that one can accomplish many different kinds of practices and dedicate the merit of that practice to the benefit of sentient beings. And that in itself is a method, in that it is taught that while one may practice some extraordinary meditation on emptiness or some extraordinary, wonderful, advanced practice, if one does not dedicate the merit of that practice to the benefit of sentient beings, and then after practicing that practice, one then engages in hatred or confusion, one can actually burn up just like that, whatever value that practice produced within the mind stream. But if one has dedicated the practice to the benefit of sentient beings, one can never do anything but increase the storehouse of merit within the mind stream. But again, one should never dedicate the practice to sentient beings in order to do that. It's a very fine line, very, very difficult to practice. One should simply dedicate one's merit to sentient beings. One should simply practice for their sake, because we have seen their suffering and it is enough. And that is the foundation, that to get that is the foundation of one's practice. That is the practice. Even within the context of preliminary practice called Ngundro, there is a practice called Bodhicitta, the practice of Bodhicitta, where one learns to become non-dual with the three precious jewels of refuge, which are the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and of course the Lama as representative of all three. And becoming non-dual with the objects of refuge, one then breathes in the suffering of sentient beings, takes it in, breathes it in, wishing fervently that by breathing it in, their suffering would be alleviated. And one sees the suffering coming to oneself, and then one breathes out all of one's virtue, dedicating it to all sentient beings for their sake, and sees that virtuous activity producing extreme happiness in them, without thought for oneself, without any concern, one practices that way. A very, very powerful practice, very effective, very strong. But of course, one can only practice such a practice if one has really considered aspirational bodhicitta, if one has really considered the protection and perfection of the objects of refuge sufficiently to take refuge and enter onto the path of the Buddha Dharma. And one can only practice this practical bodhicitta if one has thoroughly considered that one has dedicated one's life to the benefit of sentient beings.
Thank you so very much for joining with us today. Hope you enjoy the teaching. And we do show these, they are pre-recorded, and we do show them on, let me see, Wednesdays at 7:30 p.m. as well as Sundays, as you know, because you're here, at 11 a.m. on YouTube. And you can also see, they are archived on YouTube, and hopefully, you know, you can go back and check them all out. Let me see. In addition, we have meditations on the weekends, Saturdays and Sundays at 10 a.m., also on YouTube, led by one of our nuns here at the temple. And it's basically a series of short meditations that can, you know, kind of help you keep going and teach you basic meditation. And if you're, you know, more experienced practitioner, give you some support in practicing. So either way, you're welcome to join us. And daily we have on Facebook condensed medicine Buddha practice that Jetsunma created at the beginning of the COVID epidemic. And it's not just for COVID, it's for any kind of anything that requires healing, but also, you know, just anything that the medicine Buddha is still a Buddha, you know, so anything that requires healing, or you want to put prayers in for people, it's a great place to go. That's on Facebook at 7:30 every evening. And it's done live, so there's somebody, you know, moderating it and guiding you through this very short practice, which is in English, and it's very powerful. And you can share your hopes and wishes for your friends, family, and everyone else. We also daily have a soak offering that is Monday through Friday at 5:30. It's on Zoom, and you can find all of that information in the chat. You have a link to the calendar on tara.org, and the calendar will give you the events. You can click on the event, and it will come up with the location, you know, whether it's on Zoom or whether it's on YouTube or on Facebook or wherever it is, live, in person, and how to get there, and, you know, if there's any passwords, and also the practice, so that you can join in and feel like you're really part of it. So that's Monday through Friday at 5:30, and Saturdays at noon for the regular soak. Sundays at 2 has just been changed to a live soak across the street, soak being a food offering ceremony. I don't want to jargon you. And it will be at the Guru Rinpoche statue, which is just at the entrance to the park, right across the street from the temple. So if you're in the neighborhood, come and join us live. Now we're making efforts to go onto Facebook Live, but we don't have strong internet over there. So it's an iffy kind of proposition. But if you want to try to tune in at 2 p.m. on Facebook, you can find it there. Again, on the calendar, you can find a copy of the practice to join in. Otherwise, if you're in the neighborhood, it's a beautiful day. Come and join us. And it's a very powerful thing to just even be sitting there with the group as they practice. So please join in. We welcome you for all of the different events. They are listed on the calendar, and we hope you come. We hope you visit. The temple is open inside on weekends now from 11 to 4. So you can come around the south door, which is to the back of the temple, and facing all the animals, which are great fun. And just in case you want to do some meditation and do some animal petting, that's always welcome. But that's on weekends. The outside, the gardens, the park across the street, everything is open from dawn to dusk every day. So please join us as often as you can, and please stay well. If you have any prayers or any questions or anything that you want to get in touch with us for, you can always email us at kpc@tara.org. And if you want to make an offering to Jetsunma directly, having received a teaching, you're always welcome to do that. She has a PayPal account, and that's in the chat there. It's jetsunmagift@gmail.com. So join, if you choose to do that, that's great. It strengthens your connection. But either way, any way you cut it, we're always glad to have you. We're always glad that you've been with us, and hope to see you next time. Have a wonderful week.